Section 25 of White Nights and Other Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Little Hero by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated from the Russian by Constance Garnett. Part 2. Next day, early in the morning, I was summoned to a rehearsal of some tableau vivant in which I had to take part. The tableau vivant, theatricals, and afterwards a dance were all fixed for the same evening, 5 days later, the birthday of our host's younger daughter. To this entertainment, which was almost improvised, another 100 guests were invited from Moscow and from surrounding villas, so that there was a great deal of fuss, bustle, and commotion. The rehearsal, or rather review of the costumes, was fixed so early in the morning because our manager, a well-known artist, a friend of our host's, who had consented through affection for him to undertake the arrangement of the tableaux and the training of us for them, was in haste now to get to Moscow to purchase properties and to make final preparations for the fete, as there was no time to lose. I took part in one tableau with Madame M. It was a scene from medieval life, and was called The Lady of the Castle and Her Page. I felt unutterably confused on meeting Madame M. at the rehearsal. I kept feeling that she would at once read in my eyes all the reflections, the doubts, the surmises that had arisen in my mind since the previous day. I fancied too that I was, as it were, to blame in regard to her for having come upon her tears the day before and hindered her grieving, so that she could hardly help looking at me askance, as an unpleasant witness and unforgiven sharer of her secret. But thank goodness, it went off without any great trouble. I was simply not noticed. I think she had no thoughts to spare for me, or for the rehearsal. She was absent-minded, sad and gloomily thoughtful. It was evident that she was worried by some great anxiety. As soon as my part was over, I ran away to change my clothes, and 10 minutes later came out on the veranda into the garden. Almost at the same time, Madame M. came out by another door, and immediately afterwards, coming towards us, appeared her self-satisfied husband, who was returning from the garden after just escorting into it quite a crowd of ladies, and there handing them over to a competent cavaliere servant. The meeting of the husband and wife was evidently unexpected. Madame M., I don't know why, grew suddenly confused, and a faint trace of vexation was betrayed in her impatient movement. The husband, who had been carelessly whistling an air, and with an air of profundity stroking his whiskers, now, on meeting his wife, frowned and scrutinized her, as I remember now, with a markedly inquisitorial stare. "You are going into the garden?" he asked, noticing the parasol and book in her hand. "No, into the copse," she said with a slight flush. "Alone?" "With him," said Madame M., pointing to me. "I always go a walk alone in the morning," she added, speaking in an uncertain, hesitating voice, as people do when they tell their first lie. "And I have just taken the whole party there. They have all met there together in the flower arbour to see M. N. off. He is going away, you know. Something has gone wrong in Odessa. Your cousin," he meant the fair beauty, "is laughing and crying at the same time. There is no making her out. She says, though, that you are angry with M. N. about something, and so wouldn't go and see him off. Nonsense, of course." "She's laughing?" said Madame M., coming down the veranda steps. "So this is your daily cavaliere servant," added M. M., with a wry smile, turning his lorgnette upon me. "Page!" I cried, angered by the lorgnette and the jeer, and laughing straight in his face. I jumped down the 3 steps of the veranda at one bound. "A pleasant walk," muttered Monsieur M., and went on his way. Of course, I immediately joined Mme. M. as soon as she indicated me to her husband, and looked as though she had invited me to do so an hour before, and as though I had been accompanying her on her walks every morning for the last month. But I could not make out why she was so confused, so embarrassed, and what was in her mind when she brought herself to have recourse to her little lie. Why had she not simply said that she was going alone? I did not know how to look at her, but overwhelmed with wonder, I began by degrees very naively peeping into her face. But just as an hour before at the rehearsal, she did not notice either my looks or my mute question. The same anxiety, only more intense and more distinct, was apparent in her face, in her agitation, in her walk. She was in haste and walked more and more quickly, and kept looking uneasily down every avenue, down every path in the wood that led in the direction of the garden. And I, too, was expecting something. Suddenly there was the sound of horses' hoofs behind us. It was the whole party of ladies and gentlemen, on horseback, escorting Monsieur N., the gentleman who was so suddenly deserting us. Among the ladies was my fair tormentor, of whom Mme. M. had told us that she was in tears. But characteristically, she was laughing like a child, and was galloping briskly on a splendid bay horse. On reaching us, Monsieur N. took off his hat, but did not stop, nor say one word to Mme. M. Soon all the cavalcade disappeared from our sight. I glanced at Mme. M. and almost cried out in wonder. She was standing as white as a handkerchief, and big tears were gushing from her eyes. By chance our eyes met. Mme. M. suddenly flushed and turned away for an instant, and a distinct look of uneasiness and vexation flitted across her face. I was in the way, worse even than last time. That was clearer than day. But how was I to get away? And as though guessing my difficulty, Mme. M. opened the book which she had in her hand, and colouring and evidently trying not to look at me, she said, as though she had only suddenly realized it, "Ah, it is the second part. I've made a mistake. Please bring me the first." I could not but understand. My part was over, and I could not have been more directly dismissed. I ran off with her book, and did not come back. The first part lay undisturbed on the table that morning. But I was not myself. In my heart there was a sort of haunting terror. I did my utmost not to meet Mme. M., but I looked with wild curiosity at the self-satisfied person of Monsieur M., as though there must be something special about him now. I don't understand what was the meaning of my absurd curiosity. I only remember that I was strangely perplexed by all that I had chanced to see that morning. But the day was only just beginning, and it was fruitful in events for me. Dinner was very early that day. An expedition to a neighbouring hamlet, to see a village festival that was taking place there, had been fixed for the evening, and so it was necessary to be in time to get ready. I had been dreaming for the last 3 days of this excursion, anticipating all sorts of delights. Almost all the company gathered together on the verandah for coffee. I cautiously followed the others, and concealed myself behind the third row of chairs. I was attracted by curiosity, and yet I was very anxious not to be seen by Mme. M. But as luck would have it, I was not far from my fair tormentor. Something miraculous and incredible was happening to her that day. She looked twice as handsome. I don't know how and why this happens, but such miracles are by no means rare with women. There was with us at this moment a new guest, a tall, pale-faced young man, the official admirer of our fair beauty, who had just arrived from Moscow, as though on purpose to replace Monsieur N., of whom rumour said that he was desperately in love with the same lady. As for the newly arrived guest, he had, for a long time past, been on the same terms as Benedick with Beatrice in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. In short, the fair beauty was in her very best form that day. Her chatter and her jests were so full of grace, so trustfully naive, so innocently careless, that she was persuaded of the general enthusiasm with such graceful self-confidence that she really was all the time the centre of peculiar adoration. A throng of surprised and admiring listeners was continually round her, and she had never been so fascinating. Every word she uttered was marvellous and seductive, was caught up and handed round in the circle, and not one word, one jest, one sally was lost. I fancy no one had expected from her such taste, such brilliance, such wit. Her best qualities were, as a rule, buried under the most harum-scarum wilfulness, the most schoolboyish pranks, almost verging on buffoonery. They were rarely noticed, and when they were hardly believed in, so that now her extraordinary brilliancy was accompanied by an eager whisper of amazement among all. There was, however, one peculiar and rather delicate circumstance, judging at least by the part in it played by Madame M.'s husband, which contributed to her success. The madcap ventured, and I must add to the satisfaction of almost everyone, or at any rate to the satisfaction of all the young people, to make a furious attack upon him, owing to many causes, probably of great consequence in her eyes. She carried on with him a regular crossfire of witticisms, of mocking and sarcastic sallies, of that most elusive and treacherous kind, that, smoothly wrapped up on the surface, hit the mark without giving the victim anything to lay hold of, and exhaust him in fruitless efforts to repel the attack, reducing him to fury and comic despair. I don't know for certain, but I fancy the whole proceeding was not improvised but premeditated. This desperate duel had begun earlier, at dinner. I call it desperate because Monsieur M. was not quick to surrender. He had to call upon all his presence of mind, all his sharp wit and rare resourcefulness, not to be completely covered with ignominy. The conflict was accompanied by the continual and irrepressible laughter of all who witnessed and took part in it. That day was, for him, very different from the day before. It was noticeable that Madame M. several times did her utmost to stop her indiscreet friend, who was certainly trying to depict the jealous husband in the most grotesque and absurd guise, in the guise of a Bluebeard, it must be supposed, judging from all probabilities, from what has remained in my memory, and finally from the part which I myself was destined to play in the affair. I was drawn into it in a most absurd manner, quite unexpectedly, and as ill luck would have it, at that moment I was standing where I could be seen, suspecting no evil, and actually forgetting the precautions I had so long practised. Suddenly I was brought into the foreground as a sworn foe and natural rival of Monsieur M., as desperately in love with his wife, of which my persecutress vowed and swore that she had proofs, saying that only that morning she had seen in the copse. But before she had time to finish, I broke in at the most desperate minute. That minute was so diabolically calculated, was so treacherously prepared to lead up to its finale, its ludicrous denouement, and was brought out with such killing humour that a perfect outburst of irrepressible mirth saluted this last sally. And though even at the time I guessed that mine was not the most unpleasant part in the performance, yet I was so confused, so irritated and alarmed that, full of misery and despair, gasping with shame and tears, I dashed through 2 rows of chairs, stepped forward, and addressing my tormentor, cried in a voice broken with tears and indignation, "Aren't you ashamed, aloud, before all the ladies, to tell such a wicked lie? Like a small child, before all these men, What will they say? A big girl like you, and married." But I could not go on. There was a deafening roar of applause. My outburst created a perfect furor. My naive gesture, my tears, and especially the fact that I seemed to be defending M. M., all this provoked such fiendish laughter that even now I cannot help laughing at the mere recollection of it. I was overcome with confusion, senseless with horror, and burning with shame, hiding my face in my hands, rushed away, knocked a tray out of the hands of a footman who was coming in at the door, and flew upstairs to my own room. I pulled out the key, which was on the outside of the door, and locked myself in. I did well, for there was a hue and cry after me. Before a minute had passed, my door was besieged by a mob of the prettiest ladies. I heard their ringing laughter, their incessant chatter, their trilling voices. They were all twittering at once, like swallows. All of them, every one of them, begged and besought me to open the door, if only for a moment, swore that no harm should come to me, only that they wanted to smother me with kisses. But what could be more horrible than this novel threat? I simply burned with shame the other side of the door, hiding my face in the pillows, and did not open, did not even respond. The ladies kept up their knocking for a long time, but I was deaf and obdurate, as only a boy of 11 could be. But what could I do now? Everything was laid bare, everything had been exposed, everything I had so jealously guarded and concealed. Everlasting disgrace and shame had fallen on me. But it is true that I could not myself have said why I was frightened, and what I wanted to hide. Yet I was frightened of something, and had trembled like a leaf at the thought of that something's being discovered. Only till that minute I had not known what it was, whether it was good or bad, splendid or shameful, praiseworthy or reprehensible. Now in my distress, in the misery that had been forced upon me, I learned that it was absurd and shameful. Instinctively I felt at the same time that this verdict was false, inhuman, and coarse. But I was crushed, annihilated. Consciousness seemed checked in me and thrown into confusion. I could not stand up against that verdict, nor criticize it properly. I was befogged. I only felt that my heart had been inhumanly and shamelessly wounded, and was brimming over with impotent tears. I was irritated, but I was boiling with indignation and hate such as I had never felt before, for it was the first time in my life that I had known real sorrow, insult, and injury. And it was truly that, without any exaggeration. The first untried, unformed feeling had been so coarsely handled in me, a child. The first vagrant, virginal modesty had been so soon exposed and insulted. And the first and perhaps very real and aesthetic impression had been so outraged. Of course there was much my persecutors did not know, and did not divine in my sufferings. One circumstance, which I had not succeeded in analysing till then, of which I had been, as it were, afraid, partly entered into it. I went on lying on my bed in despair and misery, hiding my face in my pillow, and I was alternately feverish and shivery. I was tormented by two questions. First, what had the wretched fair beauty seen, and in fact, what could she have seen that morning in the copse between Madame M. and me? And secondly, how could I now look Madame M. in the face without dying on the spot of shame and despair? An extraordinary noise in the yard roused me at last from the state of semi-consciousness into which I had fallen. I got up and went to the window. The whole yard was packed with carriages, saddle horses, and bustling servants. It seemed that they were all setting off. Some of the gentlemen had already mounted their horses, others were taking their places in the carriages. Then I remembered the expedition to the village fete, and little by little an uneasiness came over me. I began anxiously looking for my pony in the yard, but there was no pony there, so they must have forgotten me. I could not restrain myself, and rushed headlong downstairs, thinking no more of unpleasant meetings or my recent ignominy. Terrible news awaited me. There was neither a horse nor seat in any of the carriages to spare for me. Everything had been arranged, all the seats were taken, and I was forced to give place to others. Overwhelmed by this fresh blow, I stood on the steps and looked mournfully at the long rows of coaches, carriages, and chaises in which there was not the tiniest corner left for me, and at the smartly dressed ladies whose horses were restlessly curvetting. One of the gentlemen was late. They were only waiting for his arrival to set off. His horse was standing at the door, champing the bit, pawing the earth with his hoofs, and at every moment starting and rearing. Two stable boys were carefully holding him by the bridle, and everyone else apprehensively stood at a respectful distance from him. A most vexatious circumstance had occurred, which prevented my going. In addition to the fact that new visitors had arrived, filling up all the seats, two of the horses had fallen ill, one of them being my pony. But I was not the only person to suffer. It appeared that there was no horse for our new visitor, the pale-faced young man of whom I have spoken already. To get over this difficulty, our host had been obliged to have recourse to the extreme step of offering his fiery, unbroken stallion, adding, to satisfy his conscience, that it was impossible to ride him, and that they had long intended to sell the beast for its vicious character, if only a purchaser could be found. But in spite of his warning, the visitor declared that he was a good horseman, and in any case ready to mount anything rather than not go. Our host said no more, but now I fancied that a sly and ambiguous smile was straying on his lips. He waited for the gentleman who had spoken so well of his own horsemanship, and stood, without mounting his horse, impatiently rubbing his hands and continually glancing towards the door. Some similar feeling seemed shared by the two stable boys, who were holding the stallion, almost breathless with pride at seeing themselves before the whole company, in charge of a horse which might any minute kill a man for no reason whatever. Something akin to their master's sly smile gleamed, too, in their eyes, which were round with expectation, and fixed upon the door, from which the bold visitor was to appear. The horse himself, too, behaved as though he were in league with our host and the stable boys. He bore himself proudly and haughtily, as though he felt that he were being watched by several dozen curious eyes, and were glorying in his evil reputation exactly as some incorrigible rogue might glory in his criminal exploits. He seemed to be defying the bold man who would venture to curb his independence. That bold man did at last make his appearance. Conscience-stricken at having kept everyone waiting, hurriedly drawing on his gloves, he came forward without looking at anything, ran down the steps, and only raised his eyes as he stretched out his hand to seize the mane of the waiting horse. But he was at once disconcerted by his frantic rearing and a warning scream from the frightened spectators. The young man stepped back and looked in perplexity at the vicious horse, which was quivering all over, snorting with anger, and rolling his bloodshot eyes ferociously, continually rearing on his hind legs and flinging up his forelegs, as though he meant to bolt into the air and carry the two stable boys with him. For a minute the young man stood completely nonplussed. Then, flushing slightly with some embarrassment, he raised his eyes and looked at the frightened ladies. "A very fine horse," he said, as though to himself, "and to my thinking it ought to be a great pleasure to ride him, but do you know, I think I won't go," he concluded, turning to our host, with a broad good-natured smile, which so suited his kind and clever face. "Yet I consider you are an excellent horseman, I assure you," answered the owner of the unapproachable horse, delighted. And he warmly and even gratefully pressed the young man's hand. "Just because from the first moment you saw the sort of brute you had to deal with," he added with dignity. "Would you believe me, though I have served 23 years in the Hussars, yet I've had the pleasure of being laid on the ground 3 times, thanks to that beast? That is, as often as I mounted the useless animal. Tancred, my boy, there's no one here fit for you. Your rider, it seems, must be some Ilya Muromets, and he must be sitting quiet now in the village of Kapachorovo, waiting for your teeth to fall out. Come, take him away. He has frightened people enough. It was a waste of time to bring him out, he cried, rubbing his hands complacently. It must be observed that Tancred was no sort of use to his master, and simply ate corn for nothing. Moreover, the old hussar had lost his reputation for a knowledge of horseflesh by paying a fabulous sum for the worthless beast, which he had purchased only for his beauty. Yet he was delighted now that Tancred had kept up his reputation, had disposed of another rider, and had so drawn closer on himself fresh, senseless laurels. So you are not going? Cried the blonde beauty, who was particularly anxious that her cavaliere servente should be in attendance upon this occasion. Surely you are not frightened? Upon my word I am, answered the young man. Are you in earnest? Why, do you want me to break my neck? Then make haste and get on my horse. Don't be afraid, it is very quiet. We won't delay them, they can change the saddles in a minute. I'll try to take yours. Surely Tancred can't always be so unruly. No sooner said than done. The madcap leaped out of the saddle and was standing before us as she finished the last sentence. You don't know Tancred if you think he will allow your wretched side saddle to be put on him. Besides, I would not let you break your neck. It would be a pity, said our host, at that moment of inward gratification affecting, as his habit was, a studied brusqueness and even coarseness of speech, which he thought in keeping with a jolly good fellow and an old soldier, and which he imagined to be particularly attractive to the ladies. This was one of his favourite fancies, his favourite whim, with which we were all familiar. Well, crybaby, wouldn't you like to have a try? You wanted so much to go, said the valiant horsewoman, noticing me and pointing tauntingly at Tancred, because I had been so imprudent as to catch her eye, and she would not let me go without a biting word, that she might not have dismounted from her horse absolutely for nothing. I expect you are not such a... We all know you are a hero, and would be ashamed to be afraid, especially when you will be looked at, you fine page, she added with a fleeting glance at Madame M., whose carriage was the nearest to the entrance. A rush of hatred and vengeance had flooded my heart when the fair Amazon had approached us with the intention of mounting Tancred. But I cannot describe what I felt at this unexpected challenge from the madcap. Everything was dark before my eyes when I saw her glance at Madame M. For an instant an idea flashed through my mind, but it was only a moment, less than a moment, like a flash of gunpowder. Perhaps it was the last straw, and I suddenly now was moved to rage as my spirit rose, so that I longed to put all my enemies to utter confusion, and to revenge myself on all of them, and before everyone, by showing the sort of person I was. Or whether by some miracle, some prompting from medieval history, of which I had known nothing till then, sent whirling through my giddy brain images of tournaments, paladins, heroes, lovely ladies, the clash of swords, shouts, and the applause of the crowd, and amidst those shouts the timid cry of a frightened heart, which moves the proud soul more sweetly than victory and fame. I don't know whether all this romantic nonsense was in my head at the time, or whether, more likely, only the first dawning of the inevitable nonsense that was in store for me in the future. Anyway, I felt that my hour had come. My heart leaped and shuddered, and I don't remember how, at one bound I was down the steps and beside Tancred. You think I am afraid? I cried, boldly and proudly, in such a fever that I could hardly see, breathless with excitement and flushing till the tears scalded my cheeks. Well, you shall see. And clutching at Tancred's mane, I put my foot in the stirrup before they had time to make a movement to stop me. But at that instant Tancred reared, jerked his head, and with a mighty bound forward, wrenched himself out of the hands of the petrified stable boys and dashed off like a hurricane, while everyone cried out in horror. Goodness knows how I got my other leg over the horse while it was in full gallop. I can't imagine, either, how I did not lose hold of the reins. Tancred bore me beyond the trellis gate, turned sharply to the right, and flew along beside the fence, regardless of the road. Only at that moment I heard behind me a shout from 50 voices, and that shout was echoed in my swooning heart with such a feeling of pride and pleasure that I shall never forget that mad moment of my boyhood. All the blood rushed to my head, bewildering me and overpowering my fears. I was beside myself. There certainly was, as I remember it now, something of the knight errant about the exploit. My knightly exploits, however, were all over in an instant, or it would have gone badly with the knight. And indeed I do not know how I escaped as it was. I did know how to ride, I had been taught, but my pony was more like a sheep than a riding horse. No doubt I should have been thrown off Tancred if he had had time to throw me. But after galloping 50 paces, he suddenly took fright at a huge stone which lay across the road, and bolted back. He turned sharply, galloping at full speed, so that it is a puzzle to me, even now, that I was not sent spinning out of the saddle and flying like a ball for 20 feet, that I was not dashed to pieces, and that Tancred did not dislocate his leg by such a sudden turn. He rushed back to the gate, tossing his head furiously, bounding from side to side as though drunk with rage, flinging his legs at random in the air, and at every leap trying to shake me off his back, as though a tiger had leapt on him and were thrusting its teeth and claws into his back. End of Part 2. Section 26 of White Nights and Other Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Little Hero by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated from the Russian by Constance Garnett. Part 3. In another instant I should have flown off. I was falling, but several gentlemen flew to my rescue. 2 of them intercepted the way into the open country. 2 others galloped up, closing in upon Tancred, so that their horses' sides almost crushed my legs, and both of them caught him by the bridle. A few seconds later we were back at the steps. They lifted me down from the horse, pale and scarcely breathing. I was shaking like a blade of grass in the wind. It was the same with Tancred, who was standing, his hoofs as it were thrust into the earth and his whole body thrown back, puffing his fiery breath from red and streaming nostrils, twitching and quivering all over, seeming overwhelmed with wounded pride and anger at a child's being so bold with impunity. All around me I heard cries of bewilderment, surprise and alarm. At that moment my straying eyes caught those of Mme. M., who looked pale and agitated. And I can never forget that moment. In one instant my face was flooded with color, glowed and burned like fire. I don't know what happened to me, but confused and frightened by my own feelings, I timidly dropped my eyes to the ground. But my glance was noticed. It was caught. It was stolen from me. All eyes turned on Mme. M., and finding herself unawares the center of attention, she too flushed like a child from some naive and involuntary feeling, and made an unsuccessful effort to cover her confusion by laughing. All this, of course, was very absurd looking from outside, but at the moment an extremely naive and unexpected circumstance saved me from being laughed at by everyone and gave a special color to the whole adventure. The lovely persecutor, who was the instigator of the whole escapade, and who till then had been my irreconcilable foe, suddenly rushed up to embrace and kiss me. She had hardly been able to believe her eyes when she saw me dare to accept her challenge, and pick up the gauntlet she had flung at me by glancing at Mme. M. She had almost died of terror and self-reproach when I had flown off on Tancred. Now, when it was all over, and particularly when she caught the glance at Mme. M., my confusion and my sudden flush of colour, when the romantic strain in her frivolous little head had given a new secret, unspoken significance to the moment, she was moved to such enthusiasm over my knightliness that, touched, joyful, and proud of me, she rushed up and pressed me to her bosom. She lifted the most naive, stern-looking little face, on which there quivered and gleamed two little crystal tears, and gazing at the crowd that thronged about her, said in a grave, earnest voice, such as they had never heard her use before, pointing to me, "Mais c'est très sérieux, messieurs, ne riez pas." But it is very serious, gentlemen, do not laugh. She did not notice all were standing, as though fascinated, admiring her bright enthusiasm. Her swift, unexpected action, her earnest little face, the simple-hearted naivete, the unexpected feeling, betrayed by the tears that welled in her invariably laughter-loving eyes, were such a surprise that everyone stood before her as though electrified by her expression, her rapid, fiery words and gestures. It seemed as though no one could take his eyes off her for fear of missing that rare moment in her enthusiastic face. Even our host flushed crimson as a tulip, and people declared that they heard him confess afterwards that, to his shame, he had been in love for a whole minute with his charming guest. Well, of course, after this, I was a knight, a hero. "Delorge! Toggenburg!" was heard in the crowd. There was a sound of applause. "Hurrah for the rising generation!" added the host. "But he is coming with us. He certainly must come with us," said the beauty. "We will find him a place. We must find him a place. He shall sit beside me, on my knee. But no, that's a mistake," she corrected herself, laughing, unable to restrain her mirth at our first encounter. But as she laughed she stroked my hand tenderly, doing all she could to soften me, that I might not be offended. Of course," several voices chimed in. "He must go. He has won his place." The matter was settled in a trice. The same old maid who had brought about my acquaintance with the blonde beauty was at once besieged with entreaties from all the younger people to remain at home and let me have her seat. She was forced to consent, to her intense vexation, with a smile and a stealthy hiss of anger. Her protectress, who was her usual refuge, my former foe and new friend, called to her as she galloped off on her spirited horse, laughing like a child, that she envied her and would have been glad to stay at home herself, for it was just going to rain and we should all get soaked. And she was right in predicting rain. A regular downpour came on within an hour, and the expedition was done for. We had to take shelter for some hours in the huts of the village, and had to return home between 9 and 10 in the evening in the damp mist that followed the rain. I began to be a little feverish. At the minute when I was starting, Mme. M. came up to me and expressed surprise that my neck was uncovered, and that I had nothing on over my jacket. I answered that I had not had time to get my coat. She took out a pin and pinned up the turned down collar of my shirt, took off her own neck a crimson gauze kerchief, and put it round my neck, that I might not get a sore throat. She did this so hurriedly that I had not time even to thank her. But when we got home, I found her in the little drawing room with the blonde beauty, and the pale-faced young man who had gained glory for horsemanship that day by refusing to ride Tancred. I went up to thank her and give her back the scarf. But now, after all my adventures, I felt somehow ashamed. I wanted to make haste and get upstairs, there at my leisure to reflect and consider. I was brimming over with impressions. As I gave back the kerchief, I blushed up to my ears as usual. "I bet he would like to keep the kerchief," said the young man, laughing. "One can see that he is sorry to part with your scarf." That's it, the fair lady put in. "What a boy! Oh," she said, shaking her head with obvious vexation. But she stopped in time at a grave glance from Mme. M. who did not want to carry the jest too far. I made haste to get away. "Well, you are a boy," said the madcap, overtaking me in the next room, and affectionately taking me by both hands. "Why, you should have simply not returned the kerchief if you wanted so much to have it. You should have said you put it down somewhere, and that would have been the end of it. What a simpleton! Couldn't even do that. What a funny boy!" And she tapped me on the chin with her finger, laughing at my having flushed as red as a poppy. "I am your friend now, you know, am I not? Our enmity is over, isn't it? Yes or no?" I laughed and pressed her fingers without a word. "Oh, why are you so pale and shivering? Have you caught a chill?" "Yes, I don't feel well." "Ah, poor fellow, that's the result of over excitement. Do you know what? You had better go to bed without sitting up for supper, and you will be all right in the morning. Come along." She took me upstairs, and there was no end to the care she lavished on me. Leaving me to undress, she ran downstairs, got me some tea, and brought it up herself when I was in bed. She brought me up a warm quilt as well. I was much impressed and touched by all the care and attention lavished on me. Or perhaps I was affected by the whole day, the expedition, and feverishness. As I said good night to her, I hugged her warmly, as though she were my dearest and nearest friend. And in my exhausted state, all the emotions of the day came back to me in a rush. I almost shed tears as I nestled to her bosom. She noticed my overwrought condition, and I believe my madcap herself was a little touched. "You are a very good boy," she said, looking at me with gentle eyes. "Please don't be angry with me. You won't, will you?" In fact, we became the warmest and truest of friends. It was rather early when I woke up, but the sun was already flooding the whole room with brilliant light. I jumped out of bed feeling perfectly well and strong, as though I had had no fever the day before. Indeed, I felt now unutterably joyful. I recalled the previous day, and felt that I would have given any happiness if I could at that minute have embraced my new friend, the fair-haired beauty, again as I had the night before. But it was very early, and every one was still asleep. Hurriedly dressing, I went out into the garden, and from there into the copse. I made my way where the leaves were thickest, where the fragrance of the trees was more resinous, and where the sun peeped in most gaily, rejoicing that it could penetrate the dense darkness of the foliage. It was a lovely morning. Going on further and further, before I was aware of it, I had reached the further end of the copse, and had come out on the river Moskva. It flowed at the bottom of the hill 200 paces below. On the opposite bank of the river they were mowing. I watched whole rows of sharp scythes gleam all together in the sunlight at every swing of the mower, and then vanish again like little fiery snakes going into hiding. I watched the cut grass flying on one side in dense rich swaths, and being laid in long straight lines. I don't know how long I spent in contemplation. At last I was roused from my reverie by hearing a horse snorting and impatiently pawing the ground 20 paces from me, in the track which ran from the high road to the manor house. I don't know whether I heard this horse as soon as the rider rode up and stopped there, or whether the sound had long been in my ears without rousing me from my dreaming. Moved by curiosity, I went into the copse, and before I had gone many steps, I caught the sound of voices speaking rapidly, though in subdued tones. I went up closer, carefully parting the branches of the bushes that edged the path, and at once sprang back in amazement. I caught a glimpse of a familiar white dress, and a soft feminine voice resounded like music in my heart. It was Madame M. She was standing beside a man on horseback who, stooping down from the saddle, was hurriedly talking to her, and to my amazement I recognized him as Monsieur N., the young man who had gone away the morning before, and over whose departure Monsieur M. had been so busy. But people had said at the time that he was going far away to somewhere in the south of Russia, and so I was very much surprised at seeing him with us again so early, and alone with Mme. M. She was moved and agitated as I had never seen her before, and tears were glistening on her cheeks. The young man was holding her hand and stooping down to kiss it. I had come upon them at the moment of parting. They seemed to be in haste. At last he took out of his pocket a sealed envelope, gave it to Mme. M., put one arm round her, still not dismounting, and gave her a long, fervent kiss. A minute later he lashed his horse and flew past me like an arrow. Mme. M. looked after him for some moments, then pensively and disconsolately turned homewards. But after going a few steps along the track, she seemed suddenly to recollect herself, hurriedly parted the bushes and walked on through the copse. I followed her, surprised and perplexed by all that I had seen. My heart was beating violently, as though from terror. I was, as it were, benumbed and befogged. My ideas were shattered and turned upside down. But I remember I was, for some reason, very sad. I got glimpses from time to time through the green foliage of her white dress before me. I followed her mechanically, never losing sight of her, though I trembled at the thought that she might notice me. At last she came out on the little path that led to the house. After waiting half a minute, I too emerged from the bushes. But what was my amazement when I saw lying on the red sand of the path a sealed packet, which I recognized from the first glance as the one that had been given to Mme. M. 10 minutes before. I picked it up. On both sides the paper was blank. There was no address on it. The envelope was not large, but it was fat and heavy, as though there were 3 or more sheets of notepaper in it. What was the meaning of this envelope? No doubt it would explain the whole mystery. Perhaps in it there was said all that M. N. had scarcely hoped to express in their brief, hurried interview. He had not even dismounted. Whether he had been in haste or whether he had been afraid of being false to himself at the hour of parting, God only knows. I stopped, without coming out on the path, threw the envelope in the most conspicuous place on it, and kept my eyes upon it, supposing that Mme. M. would notice the loss and come back and look for it. But after waiting 4 minutes, I could stand it no longer. I picked up my find again, put it in my pocket, and set off to overtake Mme. M. I came upon her in the big avenue in the garden. She was walking straight towards the house with a swift and hurried step, though she was lost in thought, and her eyes were on the ground. I did not know what to do. Go up to her? Give it to her? That would be as good as saying that I knew everything, that I had seen it all. I should betray myself at the first word. And how should I look at her? How would she look at me? I kept expecting that she would discover her loss and return on her tracks. Then I could, unnoticed, have flung the envelope into the path, and she would have found it. But no, we were approaching the house. She had already been noticed. As ill luck would have it, everyone had got up very early that day, because, after the unsuccessful expedition of the evening before, they had arranged something new, of which I had heard nothing. All were preparing to set off, and were having breakfast in the veranda. I waited for 10 minutes, that I might not be seen with Mme. M., and making a circuit of the garden, approached the house from the other side a long time after her. She was walking up and down the veranda with her arms folded, looking pale and agitated, and was obviously trying her utmost to suppress the agonizing, despairing misery which could be plainly discerned in her eyes, her walk, her every movement. Sometimes she went down the veranda steps and walked a few paces among the flower beds in the direction of the garden. Her eyes were impatiently greedily, even incautiously, seeking something on the sand of the path and on the floor of the veranda. There could be no doubt she had discovered her loss, and imagined she had dropped the letter somewhere here, near the house. Yes, that must be so, she was convinced of it. Someone noticed that she was pale and agitated, and others made the same remark. She was besieged with questions about her health and condolences. She had to laugh, to jest, to appear lively. From time to time she looked at her husband, who was standing at the end of the terrace, talking to two ladies, and the poor woman was overcome by the same shudder, the same embarrassment, as on the day of his first arrival. Thrusting my hand into my pocket, and holding the letter tight in it, I stood at a little distance from them all, praying to fate that Mme. M. should notice me. I longed to cheer her up, to relieve her anxiety, if only by a glance, to say a word to her on the sly. But when she did chance to look at me, I dropped my eyes. I saw her distress, and I was not mistaken. To this day I don't know her secret. I know nothing but what I saw, and what I have just described. The intrigue was not such, perhaps, as one might suppose at the first glance. Perhaps that kiss was the kiss of farewell. Perhaps it was the last slight reward for the sacrifice made to her peace and honour. M. N. was going away. He was leaving her, perhaps for ever. Even that letter I was holding in my hand, who can tell what it contained? How can one judge? And who can condemn? And yet there is no doubt that the sudden discovery of her secret would have been terrible, would have been a fatal blow for her. I still remember her face at that minute. It could not have shown more suffering. To feel, to know, to be convinced, to expect as though it were one's execution, that in a quarter of an hour, in a minute perhaps, all might be discovered, the letter might be found by someone, picked up, there was no address on it, it might be opened, and then... What then? What torture could be worse than what was awaiting her? She moved about among those who would be her judges. In another minute their smiling, flattering faces would be menacing and merciless. She would read mockery, malice, and icy contempt on those faces, and then her life would be plunged into everlasting darkness, with no dawn to follow. Yes, I did not understand it then as I understand it now. I could only have vague suspicions and misgivings, and a heartache at the thought of her danger, which I could not fully understand. But whatever lay hidden in her secret, much was expiated, if expiation were needed, by those moments of anguish of which I was witness, and which I shall never forget. But then came a cheerful summons to set off. Immediately everyone was bustling about gaily. Laughter and lively chatter were heard on all sides. Within 2 minutes the veranda was deserted. Mme. M. declined to join the party, acknowledging at last that she was not well. But thank God all the others set off. Every one was in haste, and there was no time to worry her with commiseration, inquiries, and advice. A few remained at home. Her husband said a few words to her. She answered that she would be all right directly, that he need not be uneasy, that there was no occasion for her to lie down, that she would go into the garden, alone, with me. Here she glanced at me. Nothing could be more fortunate. I flushed with pleasure, with delight. A minute later we were on the way. She walked along the same avenues and paths by which she had returned from the copse, instinctively remembering the way she had come, gazing before her with her eyes fixed on the ground, looking about intently without answering me, possibly forgetting that I was walking beside her. But when we had already reached the place where I had picked up the letter, and the path ended, Mme. M. suddenly stopped, and in a faint voice, and weak with misery, said that she felt worse, and that she would go home. But when she reached the garden fence, she stopped again and thought a minute. A smile of despair came on her lips, and utterly worn out and exhausted, resigned and making up her mind to the worst, she turned without a word and retraced her steps, even forgetting to tell me of her intention. My heart was torn with sympathy, and I did not know what to do. We went, or rather I led her, to the place from which an hour before I had heard the tramp of a horse and their conversation. Here, close to a shady elm tree, was a seat hewn out of one huge stone, about which grew ivy, wild jasmine, and dog rose. The whole wood was dotted with little bridges, arbors, grottos, and similar surprises. Madame M. sat down on the bench, and glanced unconsciously at the marvellous view that lay open before us. A minute later she opened her book, and fixed her eyes upon it without reading, without turning the pages, almost unconscious of what she was doing. It was about 9:30. The sun was already high, and was floating gloriously in the deep, dark blue sky, as though melting away in its own light. The mowers were by now far away. They were scarcely visible from our side of the river. Endless ridges of mown grass crept after them in unbroken succession, and from time to time the faintly stirring breeze wafted their fragrance to us. The never-ceasing concert of those who sow not, neither do they reap, and are free as the air they cleave with their sportive wings, was all about us. It seemed as though, at that moment, every flower, every blade of grass, was exhaling the aroma of sacrifice, was saying to its Creator, "Father, I am blessed and happy." I glanced at the poor woman, who alone was like one dead amidst all this joyous life. Two big tears hung motionless on her lashes, wrung from her heart by bitter grief. It was in my power to relieve and console this poor, fainting heart. Only I did not know how to approach the subject, how to take the first step. I was in agonies. 100 times I was on the point of going up to her, but every time my face glowed like fire. Suddenly a bright idea dawned upon me. I had found a way of doing it. I revived. "Would you like me to pick you a nosegay?" I said in such a joyful voice that Madame M. immediately raised her head and looked at me intently. "Yes, do," she said at last in a weak voice, with a faint smile, at once dropping her eyes on the book again. "Or soon they will be mowing the grass here, and there will be no flowers," I cried, eagerly setting to work. I had soon picked my nosegay, a poor simple one. I should have been ashamed to take it indoors, but how light my heart was as I picked the flowers and tied them up. The dog rose and the wild jasmine I picked closer to the seat. I knew that not far off there was a field of rye, not yet ripe. I ran there for cornflowers. I mixed them with tall ears of rye, picking out the finest and most golden. Close by I came upon a perfect nest of forget-me-nots, and my nosegay was almost complete. Farther away in the meadow there were dark blue campanulas and wild pinks, and I ran down to the very edge of the river to get yellow water lilies. At last, making my way back, and going for an instant into the wood to get some bright green fan-shaped leaves of the maple to put round the nosegay, I happened to come across a whole family of pansies, close to which, luckily for me, the fragrant scent of violets betrayed the little flower hiding in the thick lush grass, and still glistening with the drops of dew. The nosegay was complete. I bound it round with fine long grass, which twisted into a rope, and I carefully lay the letter in the centre, hiding it with the flowers, but in such a way that it could be very easily noticed if the slightest attention were bestowed upon my nosegay. I carried it to Madame M. On the way it seemed to me that the letter was lying too much in view, I hit it a little more. As I got nearer, I thrust it still further in the flowers, and finally, when I was on the spot, I suddenly poked it so deeply into the center of the nosegay that it could not be noticed at all from outside. My cheeks were positively flaming. I wanted to hide my face in my hands and run away at once. But she glanced at my flowers as though she had completely forgotten that I had gathered them. Mechanically, almost without looking, she held out her hand and took my present, but at once laid it on the seat, as though I had handed it to her for that purpose, and dropped her eyes to her book again, seeming lost in thought. I was ready to cry at this mischance. If only my nosegay were close to her, I thought. If only she had not forgotten it. I lay down on the grass not far off, put my right arm under my head and closed my eyes as though I were overcome by drowsiness. But I waited, keeping my eyes fixed on her. 10 minutes passed. It seemed to me that she was getting paler and paler. Fortunately, a blessed chance came to my aid. This was a big golden bee, brought by a kindly breeze, luckily for me. It first buzzed over my head, then flew up to Madame M. She waved it off once or twice, but the bee grew more and more persistent. At last Madame M. snatched up my nosegay and waved it before my face. At that instant the letter dropped out from among the flowers and fell straight upon the open book. I started. For some time Madame M., mute with amazement, stared first at the letter and then at the flowers which she was holding in her hands, and she seemed unable to believe her eyes. All at once she flushed, started, and glanced at me, but I caught her movement and I shut my eyes tight, pretending to be asleep. Nothing would have induced me to look her straight in the face at that moment. My heart was throbbing and leaping like a bird in the grasp of some village boy. I don't remember how long I lay with my eyes shut, 2 or 3 minutes. At last I ventured to open them. Madame M. was greedily reading the letter, and from her glowing cheeks, her sparkling, tearful eyes, her bright face, every feature of which was quivering with joyful emotion, I guessed that there was happiness in the letter, and all her misery was dispersed like smoke. An agonizing, sweet feeling gnawed at my heart. It was hard for me to go on pretending. I shall never forget that minute. Suddenly, a long way off, we heard voices. Madame M. Natalie! Natalie! Madame M. did not answer, but she got up quickly from the seat, came up to me and bent over me. I felt that she was looking straight into my face. My eyelashes quivered, but I controlled myself and did not open my eyes. I tried to breathe more evenly and quietly, but my heart smothered me with its violent throbbing. Her burning breath scorched my cheeks. She bent close down to my face as though trying to make sure. At last a kiss and tears fell on my hand, the one which was lying on my breast. Natalie! Natalie, where are you? We heard again, this time quite close. Coming, said Madame M. in her mellow, silvery voice, which was so choked and quivering with tears, and so subdued, that no one but I could hear that coming. But at that instant my heart at last betrayed me and seemed to send all my blood rushing to my face. At that instant a swift, burning kiss scalded my lips. I uttered a faint cry. I opened my eyes, but at once the same gauze kerchief fell upon them, as though she meant to screen me from the sun. An instant later she was gone. I heard nothing but the sound of rapidly retreating steps. I was alone. I pulled off her kerchief and kissed it, beside myself with rapture. For some moments I was almost frantic. Hardly able to breathe, leaning on my elbow on the grass, I stared unconsciously before me at the surrounding slopes, streaked with cornfields, at the river that flowed twisting and winding far away, as far as the eye could see, between fresh hills and villages that gleamed like dots all over the sunlit distance, at the dark blue, hardly visible forests, which seemed as though smoking at the edge of the burning sky, and a sweet stillness, inspired by the triumphant peacefulness of the picture, gradually brought calm to my troubled heart. I felt more at ease and breathed more freely, but my whole soul was full of a dumb, sweet yearning, as though a veil had been drawn from my eyes, as though at a foretaste of something. My frightened heart, faintly quivering with expectation, was groping timidly and joyfully towards some conjecture. And all at once my bosom heaved, began aching as though something had pierced it, and tears, sweet tears, gushed from my eyes. I hid my face in my hands, and quivering like a blade of grass, gave myself up to the first consciousness and revelation of my heart, the first vague glimpse of my nature. My childhood was over from that moment. When 2 hours later I returned home, I did not find Madame M. Through some sudden chance, she had gone back to Moscow with her husband. I never saw her again. End of part 3 and end.
Section 27 of White Nights and Other Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mr. Prohartchin by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated from the Russian by Constance Garnett. Part 1. In the darkest and humblest corner of Ustinya Fyodorovna's flat lived Semyon Ivanovitch Prohartchin, a well-meaning elderly man who did not drink. Since Mr. Prohartchin was of a very humble grade in the service, and received a salary strictly proportionate to his official capacity, Ustinya Fyodorovna could not get more than 5 roubles a month from him for his lodging. Some people said that she had her own reasons for accepting him as a lodger. But, be that as it may, as though in despite of all his detractors, Mr. Prohartchin actually became her favorite. In an honorable and virtuous sense, of course. It must be observed that Ustinya Fyodorovna, a very respectable woman, who had a special partiality for meat and coffee, and found it difficult to keep the fasts, let rooms to several other boarders who paid twice as much as Semyon Ivanovitch, yet not being quiet lodgers, but on the contrary, all of them spiteful scoffers at her feminine ways and her forlorn helplessness, stood very low in her good opinion, so that if it had not been for the rent they paid, she would not have cared to let them stay, nor indeed to see them in her flat at all. Semyon Ivanovitch had become her favorite from the day when a retired, or perhaps more correctly speaking, discharged clerk, with a weakness for strong drink, was carried to his last resting place in Volkovo, though this gentleman had only one eye, having had the other knocked out, owing, in his own words, to his valiant behavior, and only one leg, the other having been broken in the same way, owing to his valor. Yet he had succeeded in winning all the kindly feeling of which Ustinya Fyodorovna was capable, and took the fullest advantage of it, and would probably have gone on for years living as her devoted satellite and toady, if he had not finally drunk himself to death in the most pitiable way. All this had happened at Pesky, where Ustinya Fyodorovna only had 3 lodgers, of whom, when she moved into a new flat and set up on a larger scale, letting to about a dozen new boarders, Mr. Prohartchin was the only one who remained. Whether Mr. Prohartchin had certain incorrigible defects, or whether his companions were, every one of them, to blame, there seemed to be misunderstandings on both sides from the first. We must observe here that all Ustinya Fyodorovna's new lodgers, without exception, got on together like brothers. Some of them were in the same office. Each one of them, by turns, lost all of his money to the others at faro, preference, and bix. They all liked, in a merry hour, to enjoy what they called the fizzing moments of life in a crowd together. They were fond, too, at times, of discussing lofty subjects, and though in the end things rarely passed off without a dispute, yet, as all prejudices were banished from the whole party, the general harmony was not in the least disturbed thereby. The most remarkable among the lodgers were Mark Ivanovitch, an intelligent and well-read man, then Oplavaniev, then Prepolovenko, also a nice and modest person. Then there was a certain Zinovy Prokofyevitch, whose object in life was to get into aristocratic society. Then there was Okeanov, the copying clerk, who had in his time almost wrested the distinction of prime favorite from Semyon Ivanovitch. Then another copying clerk called Sudbin, the plebeian Kantorev. There were others too, but to all these people Semyon Ivanovitch was, as it were, not one of themselves. No one wished him harm, of course, for all had from the very first done Prohartchin justice, and had decided, in Mark Ivanovitch's words, that he, Prohartchin, was a good and harmless fellow, though by no means a man of the world, trustworthy and not a flatterer, who had, of course, his failings, but that if he were sometimes unhappy, it was due to nothing else but lack of imagination. What is more, Mr. Prohartchin, though deprived in this way of imagination, could never have made a particularly favorable impression from his figure or manners, upon which scoffers are fond of fastening. Yet his figure did not put people against him. Mark Ivanovitch, who was an intelligent person, formally undertook Semyon Ivanovitch's defense, and declared in rather happy and flowery language that Prohartchin was an elderly and respectable man, who had long, long ago passed the age of romance. And so, if Semyon Ivanovitch did not know how to get on with people, it must have been entirely his own fault. The first thing they noticed was the unmistakable parsimony and niggardliness of Semyon Ivanovitch. That was at once observed and noted, for Semyon Ivanovitch would never lend anyone his teapot, even for a moment, and that was the more unjust, as he himself hardly ever drank tea. But when he wanted anything drank, as a rule, rather a pleasant decoction of wild flowers and certain medicinal herbs, of which he always had a considerable store. His meals, too, were quite different from the other lodgers. He never, for instance, permitted himself to partake of the whole dinner provided daily by Ustinya Fyodorovna for the other boarders. The dinner cost half a rouble. Semyon Ivanovitch paid only 25 kopecks in copper, and never exceeded it, and so took either a plate of soup with pie or a plate of beef. Most frequently he ate neither soup nor beef, but he partook in moderation of white bread with onion, curd, salted cucumber, or something similar, which was a great deal cheaper, and he would only go back to his half-dinner when he could stand it no longer. Here the biographer confesses that nothing would have induced him to allude to such realistic and low details, positively shocking and offensive to some lovers of the heroic style, if it were not that these details exhibit one peculiarity, one characteristic in the hero of this story. For Mr. Prohartchin was by no means so poor as to be unable to have regular and sufficient meals, though he sometimes made out that he was. But he acted as he did, regardless of obloquy and people's prejudices, simply to satisfy his strange whims, and from frugality and excessive carefulness. All this, however, will be much clearer later on. But we will be aware of boring the reader with the description of all Semyon Ivanovitch's whims, and will omit, for instance, the curious and very amusing description of his attire. And, in fact, if it were not for Ustinya Fyodorovna's own reference to it, we should hardly have alluded even to the fact that Semyon Ivanovitch never could make up his mind to send his linen to the wash. Or, if he ever did so, it was so rarely that in the intervals one might have completely forgotten the existence of linen on Semyon Ivanovitch. From the landlady's evidence, it appeared that Semyon Ivanovitch, bless his soul, poor lamb, for 20 years had been tucked away in his corner without caring what folks thought. For all the days of his life on earth he was a stranger to socks, handkerchiefs, and all such things. And what is more, Ustinya Fyodorovna had seen with her own eyes, thanks to the decrepitude of the screen, that the poor dear man sometimes had had nothing to cover his bare skin. Such were the rumors in circulation after Semyon Ivanovitch's death. But in his lifetime, and this was one of the most frequent occasions of dissension, he could not endure it if anyone, even somebody on friendly terms with him, poked his inquisitive nose uninvited into his corner, even through an aperture in the decrepit screen. He was a taciturn man, difficult to deal with, and prone to ill health. He did not like people to give him advice. He did not care for people who put themselves forward, either. And if anyone jeered at him, or gave him advice unasked, he would fall afoul of him at once, put him to shame, and settle his business. "You are a puppy. You are a featherhead. You are not one to give advice, so there. You mind your own business, sir. You'd better count the stitches in your own socks, sir. So there." Semyon Ivanovitch was a plain man, and never used the formal modes of address to anyone. He could not bear it either when someone who knew his little ways would begin, from pure sport, pestering him with questions, such as what he had in his little trunk. Semyon Ivanovitch had one little trunk. It stood under his bed, and was guarded like the apple of his eye, and though everyone knew that there was nothing in it except old rags, 2 or 3 pairs of damaged boots, and all sorts of rubbish, yet Mr. Prohartchin prized his property very highly, and they used even to hear him at one time express dissatisfaction with his old, but still sound, lock, and talk of getting a new one of a special German pattern, with a secret spring and various complications. When on one occasion Zinovy Prokofyevitch, carried away by the thoughtlessness of youth, gave expression to the very coarse and unseemly idea that Semyon Ivanovitch was probably hiding and treasuring something in his box to leave to his descendants, everyone who happened to be by was stupefied at the extraordinary effects of Zinovy Prokofyevitch's sally. At first, Mr. Prohartchin could not find suitable terms for such a crude and coarse idea. For a long time, words dropped from his lips quite incoherently, and it was only after a while they made out that Semyon Ivanovitch was reproaching Zinovy Prokofyevitch for some shabby action in the remote past. Then they realized that Semyon Ivanovitch was predicting that Zinovy Prokofyevitch would never get into aristocratic society, and that the tailor to whom he owed a bill for his suits would beat him, would certainly beat him, because the puppy had not paid him for so long. And finally, "You puppy, you," Semyon Ivanovitch added. "Here you want to get into the hussars, but you won't, I tell you. You'll make a fool of yourself. And I'll tell you what, you puppy, when your superiors know all about it, they will take and make you a copying clerk. So that will be the end of it. Do you hear, puppy?" Then Semyon Ivanovitch subsided. But after lying down for 5 hours, to the intense astonishment of everyone, he seemed to have reached a decision, and began suddenly reproaching and abusing the young man again, at first to himself, and afterwards addressing Zinovy Prokofyevitch. But the matter did not end there, and in the evening, when Mark Ivanovitch and Prepolovenko made tea and asked Okeanov to drink it with them, Semyon Ivanovitch got up from his bed, purposely joined them, subscribing his 15 or 20 kopecks, and on the pretext of a sudden desire for a cup of tea, began at great length going into the subject, and explaining that he was a poor man, nothing but a poor man, and that a poor man like him had nothing to save. Mr. Prohartchin confessed that he was a poor man on this occasion, he said, simply because the subject had come up. That the day before yesterday he had meant to borrow a rouble from that impudent fellow, but now he should not borrow it for fear the puppy should brag. That was the fact of the matter, and that his salary was such that one could not buy enough to eat, and that, finally, a poor man, as you see, he sent his sister-in-law in Tver 5 roubles every month, and that if he did not send his sister-in-law in Tver 5 roubles every month, his sister-in-law would die. And if his sister-in-law, who was dependent on him, were dead, he, Semyon Ivanovitch, would long ago have bought himself a new suit. And Semyon Ivanovitch went on talking in this way at great length about being a poor man, about his sister-in-law, and about roubles, and kept repeating the same thing over and over again to impress it on his audience till he got into a regular muddle and relapsed into silence. Only 3 days later, when they had all forgotten about him, and no one was thinking of attacking him, he added something in conclusion, to the effect that when Zinovy Prokofyevitch went into the hussars, the impudent fellow would have his leg cut off in war, and then he would come out with a wooden leg and say, "Semyon Ivanovitch, kind friend, give me something to eat." And then Semyon Ivanovitch would not give him something to eat, and would not look at the insolent fellow. And that's how it would be, and he could just make the best of it. All this naturally seemed very curious, and at the same time fearfully amusing. Without much reflection, all the lodgers joined together for further investigation, and simply from curiosity determined to make a final onslaught on Semyon Ivanovitch en masse. And as Mr. Prohartchin, too, had of late, that is, ever since he had begun living in the same flat with them, been very fond of finding out everything about them and asking inquisitive questions, probably for private reasons of his own, relations sprang up between the opposed parties without any preparation or effort on either side, as it were by chance and of itself. To get into relations, Semyon Ivanovitch always had in reserve his peculiar, rather sly, and very ingenious maneuver, of which the reader has learned something already. He would get off his bed about tea-time, and if he saw the others gathered together in a group to make tea, he would go up to them like a quiet, sensible, and friendly person, hand over his 20 kopecks, as he was entitled to do, and announce that he wished to join them. Then the young men would wink at one another, and so indicating that they were in league together against Semyon Ivanovitch, would begin a conversation, at first strictly proper and decorous. Then one of the wittier of the party would, apropos of nothing, fall to telling them news consisting most usually of entirely false and quite incredible details. He would say, for instance, that someone had heard His Excellency that day telling Demid Vasilyevich that in his opinion married clerks were more trustworthy than unmarried, and more suitable for promotion, for they were steady, and that their capacities were considerably improved by marriage, and that therefore he, that is the speaker, in order to improve and be better fitted for promotion, was doing his utmost to enter the bonds of matrimony as soon as possible with a certain Fevronia Prokofievna. Or he would say that it had more than once been remarked about certain of his colleagues that they were entirely devoid of social graces and of well-bred, agreeable manners, and consequently unable to please ladies in a good society, and that, therefore, to eradicate this defect, it would be suitable to deduct something from their salary, and with the sum so obtained to hire a hall, where they could learn to dance, acquire the outward signs of gentlemanliness and good breeding, courtesy, respect for their seniors, strength of will, a good and grateful heart, and various agreeable qualities. Or he would say that it was being arranged that some of the clerks, beginning with the most elderly, were to be put through an examination in all sorts of subjects to raise their standard of culture, and in that way, the speaker would add, all sorts of things would come to light, and certain gentlemen would have to lay their cards on the table. In short, thousands of similar, very absurd rumors were discussed. To keep it up, everyone believed the story at once, showed interest in it, asked questions, applied it to themselves, and some of them, assuming a despondent air, began shaking their heads and asking everyone's advice, saying, what were they to do if they were to come under it? It need hardly be said that a man far less credulous and simple-hearted than Mr. Prohartchin would have been puzzled and carried away by a rumor so unanimously believed. Moreover, from all appearances, it might be safely concluded that Semyon Ivanovitch was exceedingly stupid and slow to grasp any new unusual idea, and that when he heard anything new, he had always, first, as it were, to chew it over and digest it, to find out the meaning, and, struggling with it in bewilderment, at last perhaps to overcome it, though even then in a quite special manner peculiar to himself alone. In this way, curious and hitherto unexpected qualities began to show themselves in Semyon Ivanovitch. Talk and tittle-tattle followed, and by devious ways it all reached the office at last with additions. What increased the sensation was the fact that Mr. Prohartchin, who had looked almost exactly the same from time immemorial, suddenly, apropos of nothing, wore quite a different countenance. His face was uneasy, his eyes were timid, and had a scared, rather suspicious expression. He took to walking softly, starting and listening, and to put the finishing touch to his new characteristics, developed a passion for investigating the truth. He carried his love of truth at last to such a pitch as to venture on 2 occasions to inquire of Demid Vasilyevich himself concerning the credibility of the strange rumors that reached him daily by dozens. And if we say nothing here of the consequence of the action of Semyon Ivanovitch, it is for no other reason but a sensitive regard for his reputation. It was in this way people came to consider him as misanthropic and regardless of the proprieties. Then they began to discover that there was a great deal that was fantastical about him, and in this they were not altogether mistaken, for it was observed on more than one occasion that Semyon Ivanovitch completely forgot himself, and sitting in his seat with his mouth open and his pen in the air, as though frozen or petrified, looked more like the shadow of a rational being than that rational being itself. It sometimes happened that some innocently gaping gentleman, on suddenly catching his straying, lustreless, questioning eyes, was scared and all of a tremor, and at once inserted into some important document either a smudge or some quite inappropriate word. The impropriety of Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior embarrassed and annoyed all really well-bred people. At last, no one could feel any doubt of the eccentricity of Semyon Ivanovitch's mind, and when one fine morning the rumor was all over the office that Mr. Prohartchin had actually frightened Demid Vassilyevitch himself, for, meeting him in the corridor, Semyon Ivanovitch had been so strange and peculiar that he had forced his superior to beat a retreat. The news of Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior reached him himself at last. Hearing of it, he got up at once, made his way carefully between the chairs and tables, reached the entry, took down his overcoat with his own hand, put it on, went out, and disappeared for an indefinite period. Whether he was led into this by alarm or by some other impulse we cannot say, but no trace was seen of him for a time, either at home or at the office. We will not attribute Semyon Ivanovitch's fate simply to his eccentricity. Yet we must observe to the reader that our hero was a very retiring man, unaccustomed to society, and had, until he had made the acquaintance of the new lodgers, lived in complete unbroken solitude, and had been marked by his quietness and even a certain mysteriousness, for he had spent all the time that he lodged at Pesky lying on his bed behind the screen, without talking or having any sort of relations with anyone. Both his old fellow lodgers lived exactly as he did. They, too, were somehow mysterious people, and spent 15 years lying behind their screens. The happy, drowsy hours and days trailed by, one after the other, in patriarchal stagnation, and as everything around them went its way in the same happy fashion, neither Semyon Ivanovitch nor Ustinya Fyodorovna could remember exactly when fate had brought them together. "It may be 10 years, it may be 20, it may be even 25 altogether," she would say at times to her new lodgers, "since he settled with me. Poor dear man, bless his heart." And so it was very natural that the hero of our story, being so unaccustomed to society, was disagreeably surprised when, a year before, he, a respectable and modest man, had found himself suddenly in the midst of a noisy and boisterous crew, consisting of a dozen young fellows, his colleagues at the office, and his new housemates. The disappearance of Semyon Ivanovitch made no little stir in the lodgings. One thing was that he was the favorite. Another, that his passport, which had been in the landlady's keeping, appeared to have been accidentally mislaid. Ustinya Fyodorovna raised a howl, as was her invariable habit on all critical occasions. She spent 2 days in abusing and upbraiding the lodgers. She wailed that they had chased away her lodger like a chicken, and all those spiteful scoffers had been the ruin of him. And on the 3rd day she sent them all out to hunt for the fugitive, and at all costs to bring him back, dead or alive. Towards evening, Sudbin first came back with the news that traces had been discovered, that he had himself seen the runaway in Tolkuchi Market and other places, had followed and stood close to him, but had not dared to speak to him. He had been near him in a crowd, watching a house on fire in Crooked Lane. Half an hour later, Okeanov and Kantarev came in, and confirmed Sudbin's story word for word. They, too, had stood near, had followed him quite close, had stood not more than 10 paces from him, but they also had not ventured to speak to him. But both observed that Semyon Ivanovitch was walking with a drunken cadger. The other lodgers were all back and together at last, and after listening attentively they made up their minds that Prohartchin could not be far off and would not be long in returning. But they said that they had all known beforehand that he was about with a drunken cadger. This drunken cadger was a thoroughly bad lot, insolent and cringing, and it seemed evident that he had got around Semyon Ivanovitch in some way. He had turned up just a week before Semyon Ivanovitch's disappearance in company with Remnev, had spent a little time in the flat telling them that he had suffered in the cause of justice, that he had formerly been in the service in the provinces, that an inspector had come down on them, that he and his associates had somehow suffered in a good cause, that he had come to Petersburg and had fallen at the feet of Porfiry Grigorievitch, that he had been got by interest into a department, but through the cruel persecution of fate he had been discharged from there too, and that afterwards, through reorganization, the office itself had ceased to exist, and that he had not been included in the new revised staff of clerks, owing as much to direct incapacity for official work as to capacity for something else quite irrelevant. All this mixed up with his passion for justice and, of course, the trickery of his enemies. After finishing his story, in the course of which Mr. Zimoveykin more than once kissed his sullen and unshaven friend Remnev, he bowed down to all in the room in turn, not forgetting Avdotya, the servant, called them all his benefactors, and explained that he was an undeserving, troublesome, mean, insolent, and stupid man, and that good people must not be hard on his pitiful plight and simplicity. After begging for their kind protection, Mr. Zimoveykin showed his livelier side, grew very cheerful, kissed Ustinya Fyodorovna's hands, in spite of her modest protests that her hand was coarse and not like a lady's, and towards evening promised to show the company his talent in a remarkable character dance. But next day his visit ended in a lamentable denouement, either because there had been too much character in the character dance, or because he had, in Ustinya Fyodorovna's own words, somehow insulted her and treated her as no lady, though she was on friendly terms with Yaroslav Ilyitch himself, and if she liked, might long ago have been an officer's wife. Zimoveykin had to steer for home the next day. He went away, came back again, and was again turned out with ignominy, then wormed his way into Semyon Ivanovitch's good graces, robbed him incidentally of his new breeches, and now it appeared that he had led Semyon Ivanovitch astray. As soon as the landlady knew that Semyon Ivanovitch was alive and well, and that there was no need to hunt for his passport, she promptly left off grieving and was pacified. Meanwhile, some of the lodgers determined to give the runaway a triumphal reception. They broke the bolt and moved away the screen from Mr. Prohartchin's bed, rumpled up the bed a little, took the famous box, put it at the foot of the bed, and on the bed laid the sister-in-law, that is, a dummy made up of an old kerchief, a cap, and a mantle of the landlady's, such an exact counterfeit of his sister-in-law that it might have been mistaken for one. Having finished their work, they waited for Semyon Ivanovitch to return, meaning to tell him that his sister-in-law had arrived from the country, and was there behind his screen, poor thing. But they waited and waited. Already, while they waited, Mark Ivanovitch had staked and lost half a month's salary to Prepolovenko and Kantarev. Already Okeanov's nose had grown red and swollen playing flips on the nose and 3 cards. Already Avdotya the servant had almost had her sleep out and had twice been on the point of getting up to fetch the wood to light the stove. And Zinovy Prokofyevitch, who kept running out every minute to see whether Semyon Ivanovitch were coming, was wet to the skin. But there was no sign of anyone yet, neither Semyon Ivanovitch nor the drunken cadger. At last everyone went to bed, leaving the sister-in-law behind the screen in readiness for any emergency. And it was not till 4 o'clock that a knock was heard at the gate. But when it did come, it was so loud that it quite made up to the expectant lodgers for all the wearisome trouble they had been through. It was he himself, Semyon Ivanovitch, Mr. Prohartchin, but in such a condition that they all cried out in dismay, and no one thought about the sister-in-law. The lost man was unconscious. He was brought in, or more correctly carried in, by a sopping and tattered night cabman. To the landlady's question where the poor dear man had got so groggy, the cabman answered, "Why, he is not drunk. He has not had a drop, that I can tell you for sure, but seemingly a faintness has come over him." Section 28 of White Nights and Other Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mr. Prohartchin by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated from the Russian by Constance Garnett. Part 2. They began examining him, propping the culprit against the stove to do so more conveniently, and saw that it really was not a case of drunkenness, nor had he had a blow, but that something else was wrong, for Semyon Ivanovitch could not utter a word, but seemed twitching in a sort of convulsion, and only blinked, fixing his eyes in bewilderment, first on one and then on another of the spectators, who were all attired in night array. Then they began questioning the cabman, asking where he had got him from. "Why, from the folks out Kolomna way," he answered. "Deuce knows what they are. Not exactly gentry, but merry, rollicking gentlemen. So he was like this when they gave him to me. Whether they had been fighting, or whether he was in some sort of fit, goodness knows what it was, but they were nice, jolly gentlemen." Semyon Ivanovitch was taken, lifted high on the shoulders of 2 or 3 sturdy fellows, and carried to his bed. When Semyon Ivanovitch, on being put in bed, felt the sister-in-law, and put his feet on his sacred box, he cried out at the top of his voice, squatted up almost on his heels, and trembling and shaking all over with his hands and his body, he cleared a space as far as he could in his bed, while gazing with a tremulous but strangely resolute look at those present. He seemed, as it were, to protest that he would sooner die than give up the 100th part of his poor belongings to anyone. Semyon Ivanovitch lay for 2 or 3 days, closely barricaded by the screen, and so cut off from all the world and all its vain anxieties. Next morning, of course, everyone had forgotten about him. Time, meanwhile, flew by as usual. Hour followed hour, day followed day. The sick man's heavy, feverish brain was plunged in something between sleep and delirium, but he lay quietly and did not moan or complain. On the contrary, he kept still and silent and controlled himself, lying low in his bed, just as the hare lies close to the earth when it hears the hunter. At times a long, depressing stillness prevailed in the flat, a sign that the lodgers had all gone to the office, and Semyon Ivanovitch, waking up, could relieve his depression by listening to the bustle in the kitchen, where the landlady was busy close by, or to the regular flop of Avdotya's downtrodden slippers, as, sighing and moaning, she cleared away, rubbed and polished, tidying all the rooms in the flat. Whole hours passed by in that way, drowsy, languid, sleepy, wearisome, like the water that dripped with a regular sound from the locker into the basin in the kitchen. At last the lodgers would arrive, one by one or in groups, and Semyon Ivanovitch could very conveniently hear them abusing the weather, saying they were hungry, making a noise, smoking, quarreling, and making friends, playing cards, and clattering the cups as they got ready for tea. Semyon Ivanovitch mechanically made an effort to get up and join them, as he had a right to do at tea, but he at once sank back into drowsiness, and dreamed that he had been sitting a long time at the tea-table, having tea with them and talking, and that Zinovy Prokofyevitch had already seized the opportunity to introduce into the conversation some scheme concerning sisters-in-law and the moral relation of various worthy people to them. At this point Semyon Ivanovitch was in haste to defend himself and reply, but the mighty formula that flew from every tongue, "It has more than once been observed," cut short all his objections, and Semyon Ivanovitch could do nothing better than begin dreaming again that today was the 1st of the month, and that he was receiving money in his office. Undoing the paper round it on the stairs, he looked about him quickly, and made haste as fast as he could to subtract half of the lawful wages he had received, and conceal it in his boot. Then, on the spot, on the stairs, quite regardless of the fact that he was in bed and asleep, he made up his mind when he reached home to give his landlady what was due for board and lodging, and then to buy certain necessities, and to show any one it might concern, as it were casually and unintentionally, that some of his salary had been deducted, that now he had nothing left to send to his sister-in-law. Then to speak with commiseration of his sister-in-law, to say a great deal about her the next day and the day after, and 10 days later to say something casually again about her poverty, that his companions might not forget. Making this determination, he observed that Andrei Efimovitch, that everlastingly silent, bald little man who sat in the office 3 rooms from where Semyon Ivanovitch sat, and hadn't said a word to him for 20 years, was standing on the stairs, that he, too, was counting his silver roubles, and shaking his head. He said to him, "Money. If there's no money, there will be no porridge," he added grimly as he went down the stairs, and just at the door he ended, "And I have 7 children, sir." Then the little bald man, probably equally unconscious that he was acting as a phantom and not as a substantial reality, held up his hand about 30 inches from the floor, waving it vertically, muttered that the eldest was going to school, then glancing with indignation at Semyon Ivanovitch, as though it were Mr. Prohartchin's fault that he was the father of 7, pulled his hat down over his eyes, and with a whisk of his overcoat he turned to the left and disappeared. Semyon Ivanovitch was quite frightened, and though he was fully convinced of his own innocence in regard to the unpleasant accumulation of 7 under one roof, yet it seemed to appear that in fact no one else was to blame but Semyon Ivanovitch. Panic-stricken, he set off running, for it seemed to him that the bald gentleman had turned back, was running after him, and meant to search him and take away all his salary, insisting upon the indisputable number 7, and resolutely denying any possible claim of any sort of sisters-in-law upon Semyon Ivanovitch. Prohartchin ran and ran, gasping for breath. Beside him was running too an immense number of people, and all of them were jingling their money in the tail pockets of their skimpy little dress coats. At last every one ran up. There was the noise of fire engines, and whole masses of people carried him almost on their shoulders up to that same house on fire which he had watched last time in company with the drunken cadger. The drunken cadger, alias Mr. Zimoveykin, was there now too. He met Semyon Ivanovitch, made a fearful fuss, took him by the arm, and led him into the thickest part of the crowd. Just as then, in reality, All about them was the noise and the uproar of an immense crowd of people, flooding the whole of Fontanka embankment between the two bridges as well as the surrounding streets and alleys. Just as then Semyon Ivanovitch, in company with the drunken cadger, was carried along behind a fence, where they were squeezed as though in pincers in a huge timber yard full of spectators who had gathered from the street, from Tolkuchi market, and from all the surrounding houses, taverns, and restaurants. Semyon Ivanovitch saw all this, and felt as he had done at the time. In the whirl of fever and delirium, all sorts of strange figures began flitting before him. He remembered some of them. One of them was a gentleman who had impressed everyone extremely, a man 7 feet high, with whiskers half a yard long, who had been standing behind Semyon Ivanovitch's back during the fire, and had given him encouragement from behind when our hero had felt something like ecstasy, and had stamped as though intending thereby to applaud the gallant work of the firemen, from which he had an excellent view from his elevated position. Another was the sturdy lad from whom our hero had received a shove by way of a lift onto another fence, when he had been disposed to climb over it, possibly to save someone. He had a glimpse, too, of the figure of the old man with a sickly face, in an old wadded dressing-gown, tied around the waist, who had made his appearance before the fire in a little shop, buying sugar and tobacco for his lodger, and who now, with a milk-can and a quart pot in his hands, made his way through the crowd to the house in which his wife and daughter were burning, together with 13.5 rubles in the corner under the bed. But most distinct of all was the poor, sinful woman of whom he had dreamed more than once during his illness. She stood before him now as she had done then, in wretched bark shoes and rags, with a crutch and a wicker basket on her back. She was shouting more loudly than the firemen or the crowd, waving her crutch in her arms, saying that her own children had turned her out, and that she had lost 2 coppers in consequence. The children and the coppers and the children were mingled together in an utterly incomprehensible muddle, from which everyone withdrew baffled, after vain efforts to understand. But the woman would not desist. She kept wailing, shouting, and waving her arms, seeming to pay no attention either to the fire up to which she had been carried by the crowd from the street, or to the people about her, or to the misfortune of strangers, or even to the sparks and red-hot embers which were beginning to fall in showers on the crowd standing near. At last Mr. Prohartchin felt that a feeling of terror was coming upon him, for he saw clearly that all this was not, so to say, an accident, and that he would not get off scot-free. And indeed, upon the woodstack close to him was a peasant in a torn smock that hung loose about him, with his hair and beard singed, and he began stirring up all the people against Semyon Ivanovitch. The crowd pressed closer and closer. The peasant shouted, and foaming at the mouth with horror, Mr. Prohartchin suddenly realized that this peasant was a cabman whom he had cheated 5 years before in a most inhuman way, slipping away from him without paying, through a side gate, and jerking up his heels as he ran as though he were barefoot on hot bricks. In despair, Mr. Prohartchin tried to speak, to scream, but his voice failed him. He felt that the infuriated crowd was twining round him like a many-colored snake, strangling him, crushing him. He made an incredible effort, and awoke. Then he saw that he was on fire, and that all his corner was on fire, that his screen was on fire, that the whole flat was on fire, together with Ustinya Fyodorovna and all her lodgers, that his bed was burning, his pillow, his quilt, his box, and last of all his precious mattress. Semyon Ivanovitch jumped up, clutched at the mattress, and ran, dragging it after him. But in the landlady's room, into which, regardless of decorum, our hero ran, just as he was, barefoot and in his shirt, he was seized, held tight, and triumphantly carried back behind the screen, which meanwhile was not on fire. It seemed that it was rather Semyon Ivanovitch's head that was on fire, and was put back to bed. It was just as some tattered, unshaven, ill-humored organ-grinder puts away in his travelling box the Punch who has been making an upset, drubbing all the other puppets, selling his soul to the devil, and who at last ends his existence, till the next performance, in the same box with the devil, the negroes, the Pierrot, and Mademoiselle Katerina, with her fortunate lover, the captain. Immediately everyone, young and old, surrounded Semyon Ivanovitch, standing in a row round his bed and fastening eyes full of expectation on the invalid. Meantime he had come to himself, but from shame, or some other feeling, began pulling up the quilt over him, apparently wishing to hide himself under it from the attention of his sympathetic friends. At last Mark Ivanovitch was the first to break the silence, and as a sensible man he began saying in a very friendly way that Semyon Ivanovitch must keep calm, that it was too bad and a shame to be ill, that only little children behaved like that, and that he must get well and go to the office. Mark Ivanovitch ended by a little joke, saying that no regular salary had yet been fixed for invalids, and as he knew for a fact that their grade would be very low in the service, to his thinking anyway, their calling or condition did not promise great and substantial advantages. In fact, it was evident that they were all taking genuine interest in Semyon Ivanovitch's fate, and were very sympathetic. But with incomprehensible rudeness, Semyon Ivanovitch persisted in lying in bed in silence and obstinately pulling the quilt higher and higher over his head. Mark Ivanovitch, however, would not be gainsaid, and restraining his feelings, said something very honeyed to Semyon Ivanovitch again, knowing that that was how he ought to treat a sick man. But Semyon Ivanovitch would not feel this. On the contrary, he muttered something between his teeth with the most distrustful air, and suddenly began glancing askance from right to left in a hostile way, as though he would have reduced his sympathetic friends to ashes with his eyes. It was no use letting it stop there. Mark Ivanovitch lost patience, and seeing that the man was offended and completely exasperated, and had simply made up his mind to be obstinate, told him straight out, without any softening suavity, that it was time to get up, that it was no use lying there, that shouting day and night about houses on fire, sisters-in-law, drunken cadgers, locks, boxes, and goodness knows what, was all stupid, improper, and degrading, for if Semyon Ivanovitch did not want to sleep himself, he should not hinder other people, and please would he bear it in mind. This speech produced its effects, for Semyon Ivanovitch, turning promptly to the orator, articulated firmly, though in a hoarse voice, "You hold your tongue, puppy! You idle speaker! You foul-mouthed man! Do you hear, young dandy? Are you a prince, eh? Do you understand what I say?" Hearing such insults, Mark Ivanovitch fired up, but realizing that he had to deal with a sick man, magnanimously overcame his resentment and tried to shame him out of his humour, but was cut short in that too, for Semyon Ivanovitch observed at once that he would not allow people to play with him, for all that Mark Ivanovitch wrote poetry. Then, following a silence of 2 minutes, at last recovering from his amazement, Mark Ivanovitch plainly, clearly, in well-chosen language, but with firmness, declared that Semyon Ivanovitch ought to understand that he was among gentlemen, and, "You ought to understand, sir, how to behave with gentlemen." Mark Ivanovitch could on occasion speak effectively, and liked to impress his hearers, but probably from the habit of years of silence, Semyon Ivanovitch talked and acted somewhat abruptly, and moreover When he did on occasion begin a long sentence, as he got further into it, every word seemed to lead to another word, that other word to a third word, and the third to a fourth, and so on, so that his mouth seemed brimming over. He began stuttering, and the crowded words took to flying out in picturesque disorder. That was why Semyon Ivanovitch, who was a sensible man, sometimes talked terrible nonsense. "You are lying," he said now. "You booby, you loose fellow, you'll come to want. You'll go begging, you seditious fellow. You loafer, take that, you poet." "Why, you are still raving, aren't you, Semyon Ivanovitch?" "I tell you what," answered Semyon Ivanovitch, "fools rave, drunkards rave, dogs rave, but a wise man acts sensibly. I tell you, you don't know your own business, you loafer, you educated gentleman, you learned book. Here, you'll get on fire and not notice your head's burning off. What do you think of that?" "Why, you mean... How do you mean? Burn my head off, Semyon Ivanovitch?" Mark Ivanovitch said no more, for everyone saw clearly that Semyon Ivanovitch was not in his sober senses, but delirious. But the landlady could not resist remarking at this point that the house in Crooked Lane had been burnt owing to a bald wench, that there was a bald-headed wench living there, that she had lighted a candle and set fire to the lumber room, but nothing would happen in her place, and everything would be all right in the flats. "But look here, Semyon Ivanovitch," cried Zinovy Prokofyevitch, losing patience and interrupting the landlady. "You old fogey, you old crock, you silly fellow, are they making jokes with you now about your sister-in-law or examinations and dancing? Is that it? Is that what you think?" "Now, I tell you what," answered our hero, sitting up in bed and making a last effort in a paroxysm of fury with his sympathetic friends. "Who's the fool? You are the fool. A dog is a fool, you joking gentleman. But I am not going to make jokes to please you, sir. Do you hear, puppy? I'm not your servant, sir." Semyon Ivanovitch would have said something more, but he fell back in bed helpless. His sympathetic friends were left gaping in perplexity, for they understood now what was wrong with Semyon Ivanovitch, and did not know how to begin. Suddenly the kitchen door creaked and opened, and the drunken cadger, alias Mr. Zimoveykin, timidly thrust in his head, cautiously sniffing round the place as his habit was. It seemed as though he had been expected. Everyone waved to him at once to come quickly, and Zimoveykin, highly delighted, with the utmost readiness and haste, jostled his way to Semyon Ivanovitch's bedside. It was evident that Zimoveykin had spent the whole night in vigil and in great exertions of some sort. The right side of his face was plastered up. His swollen eyelids were wet from his running eyes, his coat and all his clothes were torn, while the whole left side of his attire was bespattered with something extremely nasty, possibly mud from a puddle. Under his arm was somebody's violin, which he had been taking somewhere to sell. Apparently they had not made a mistake in summoning him to their assistance, for seeing the position of affairs, he addressed the delinquent at once, and with the air of a man who knows what he is about and feels that he has the upper hand, said, "What are you thinking about? Get up, Senka! What are you doing, a clever chap like you? Be sensible, or I shall pull you out of bed if you are obstreperous. Don't be obstreperous." This brief but forcible speech surprised them all. Still more they were surprised when they noticed that Semyon Ivanovitch, hearing all this and seeing this person before him, was so flustered and reduced to such confusion and dismay that he could scarcely mutter through his teeth in a whisper the inevitable protest. "Go away, you wretch," he said. "You are a wretched creature. You are a thief. Do you hear? Do you understand? You are a great swell, my fine gentleman, you regular swell." No, my boy, Zimoveykin answered emphatically, retaining all his presence of mind. You're wrong there, you wise fellow, you regular Prohartchin. Zimoveykin went on, parodying Semyon Ivanovitch and looking around gleefully. Don't be obstreperous. Behave yourself, Senka. Behave yourself, or I'll give you away. I'll tell them all about it, my lad. Do you understand? Apparently, Semyon Ivanovitch did understand, for he started when he heard the conclusion of the speech and began looking rapidly about him with an utterly desperate air. Satisfied with the effect, Mr. Zimoveykin would have continued, but Mark Ivanovitch checked his zeal, and, waiting till Semyon Ivanovitch was still and almost calm again, began judiciously impressing on the uneasy invalid at great length that to harbor ideas such as he now had in his head was, first, useless, and secondly, not only useless, but harmful, and, in fact, not so much harmful as positively immoral, and the cause of it all was that Semyon Ivanovitch was not only a bad example, but led them all into temptation. Everyone expected satisfactory results from this speech. Moreover, by now Semyon Ivanovitch was quite quiet, and replied in measured terms. A quiet discussion followed. They appealed to him in a friendly way, inquiring what he was so frightened of. Semyon Ivanovitch answered, but his answers were irrelevant. They answered him, he answered them. There was one or two more observations on both sides, and then everyone rushed into discussion, for suddenly such a strange and amazing subject cropped up that they did not know how to express themselves. The argument at last led to impatience. Impatience led to shouting, and shouting even to tears, and Mark Ivanovitch went away at last foaming at the mouth and declaring that he had never known such a blockhead. Oplovanyev spat in disgust. Okeanov was frightened. Zinovy Prokofyevitch became tearful, while Ustinya Fyodorovna positively howled, wailing that her lodger was leaving them and had gone off his head, that he would die, poor dear man, without a passport and without telling anyone, while she was a lone, forlorn woman, and that she would be dragged from pillar to post. In fact, they all saw clearly at last that the seed they had sown had yielded 100-fold, that the soil had been too productive, and that in their company Semyon Ivanovitch had succeeded in overstraining his wits completely, and in the most irrevocable manner. Everyone subsided into silence, for though they saw that Semyon Ivanovitch was frightened, the sympathetic friends were frightened too. "What?" cried Mark Ivanovitch. "But what are you afraid of? What have you gone off your head about? Who's thinking about you, my good sir? Have you the right to be afraid? Who are you? What are you? Nothing, sir. A round naught, sir. That is what you are. What are you making a fuss about? A woman has been run over in the street. So are you going to be run over? Some drunkard did not take care of his pocket. But is that any reason why your coat-tails should be cut off? A house is burnt down, so your head is to be burnt off, is it? Is that it, sir? Is that it?" You stupid," muttered Semyon Ivanovitch. "If your nose were cut off, you would eat it up with a bit of bread and not notice it." "I may be a dandy," shouted Mark Ivanovitch, not listening. "I may be a regular dandy, but I have not to pass an examination to get married, to learn dancing. The ground is firm under me, sir. Why, my good man, haven't you room enough? Is the floor giving way under your feet, or what?" "Well, they won't ask you, will they? They'll shut one up, and that will be the end of it." "The end of it? That's what's up? What's your idea now, eh?" "Why, they kicked out the drunken cadger." "Yes, but you see that was a drunkard, and you are a man, and so am I." "Yes, I am a man. It's there all right one day, and then it's gone." Gone? But what do you mean by it?
Why, the office. Office.
Yes, you blessed man, but of course the office is wanted and necessary.
It is wanted, I tell you. It's wanted today, and it's wanted tomorrow. But the day after tomorrow, it will not be wanted. You have heard what happened?
Why, but they'll pay you your salary for the year, you doubting Thomas, you man of little faith. They'll put you into another job on account of your age.
Salary? But what if I have spent my salary? If thieves come and take my money, and I have a sister-in-law, do you hear? A sister-in-law, you battering ram.
A sister-in-law? You are a man.
Yes, I am. I am a man. But you are a well-read gentleman, and a fool. Do you hear? You battering ram, you regular battering ram. That's what you are. I'm not talking about your jokes. But there are jobs such that all of a sudden they are done away with. And Demid, do you hear? Demid Vasilyevich says that the post will be done away with.
Oh, bless you with your Demid, you sinner. Why, you know,
in a twinkling of an eye, you'll be left without a post. And then you'll just have to make the best of it.
Why, you're simply raving, or clean off your head. Tell us plainly, what have you done? Own up if you have done something wrong. It's no use being ashamed. Are you off your head, my good man? Eh? He's off his head. He's gone off his head, they all cried and wrung their hands in despair, while the landlady threw both Section 29 of White Nights and Other Stories by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mr. Prohartchin by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, translated from the Russian by Constance Garnett. Part 3. You heathen! You heathenish soul! You wise man! Zimoveykin besought him. Senka, you are not a man to take offense. You are a polite, prepossessing man. You are simple. You are good. Do you hear? It all comes from your goodness. Here, I am a ruffian and a fool. I am a beggar, but good people haven't abandoned me. No fear. You see they treat me with respect. I thank them, and the landlady. Here, you see, I bow down to the ground to them. Here, see, I am paying what is due to you, landlady. At this point, Zimoveykin swung off with pedantic dignity, a low bow, right down to the ground. After that, Semyon Ivanovitch would have gone on talking, but this time they would not let him. They all intervened, began entreating him, assuring him, comforting him, and succeeded in making Semyon Ivanovitch thoroughly ashamed of himself. And at last, in a faint voice, he asked leave to explain himself.
Very well, then, he said, I am prepossessing. I am quiet, I am good, faithful, and devoted. To the last drop of my blood, you know. Do you hear, you puppy, you swell? Granted, the job is going on, but you see, I am poor, and what if they take it? Do you hear, you swell? Hold your tongue and try to understand. They'll take it, and that's all about it. It's going on, brother, and then not going on. Do you understand? And I shall go begging my bread. Do you hear?
Senka, Zimoveykin bawled frantically, drowning the general hubbub with his voice. You are seditious. I'll inform against you. What are you saying? Who are you? Are you a rebel? You sheep's head? A rowdy? Stupid man that they would turn off without a character? But what are you?
Well, that's just it.
What? Well, there it is. Well, how do you mean? Why, I'm free. He's free. And here one lies and thinks, what? What if they say I'm seditious? Seditious? Senka, you seditious? Stay, cried Mr. Prohartchin, waving his hand and interrupting the rising uproar. That's not what I mean. Try to understand, only try to understand, you sheep. I am law-abiding. I am law-abiding today. I am law-abiding tomorrow. And then all of a sudden they kick me out and call me seditious. What are you saying? Mark Ivanovitch thundered at last, jumping up from the chair on which he had sat down to rest, running up to the bed and in a frenzy, shaking with vexation and fury. What do you mean, you sheep? You've nothing to call your own. Why, are you the only person in the world? Was the world made for you, do you suppose? Are you a Napoleon? What are you? Who are you? Are you a Napoleon, eh? Tell me, are you a Napoleon? But Mr. Prohartchin did not answer this question. Not because he was overcome with shame at being a Napoleon, and was afraid of taking upon himself such a responsibility. No, he was incapable of disputing further, or saying anything. His illness had reached a crisis. Tiny teardrops gushed suddenly from his glittering, feverish gray eyes. He hid his burning head in his bony hands that were wasted by illness, sat up in bed, and sobbing began to say that he was quite poor, that he was a simple, unlucky man, that he was foolish and unlearned. He begged kind folks to forgive him, to take care of him, to protect him, to give him food and drink, not to leave him in want. And goodness knows what else Semyon Ivanovitch said. As he uttered this appeal, he looked about him in wild terror, as though he were expecting the ceiling to fall or the floor to give way. Every one felt his heart soften and move to pity as he looked at the poor fellow. The landlady, sobbing and wailing like a peasant woman at her forlorn condition, laid the invalid back in bed with her own hands. Mark Ivanovitch, seeing the uselessness of touching upon the memory of Napoleon, instantly relapsed into kindliness, and came to her assistance. The others, in order to do something, suggested raspberry tea, saying that it always did good at once, and that the invalid would like it very much. But Zimoveykin contradicted them all, saying there was nothing better than a good dose of chamomile, or something of the sort. As for Zinovy Prokofyevitch, having a good heart, he sobbed and shed tears in his remorse for having frightened Semyon Ivanovitch with all sorts of absurdities, and gathering from the invalid's last words that he was quite poor and needing assistance, he proceeded to get up a subscription for him, confining it for a time to the tenants of the flat. Every one was sighing and moaning, every one felt sorry and grieved. And yet all wondered how it was a man could be so completely panic-stricken. And what was he frightened about? It would have been all very well if he had had a good post, had had a wife, a lot of children. It would have been excusable if he were being hauled up before the court on some charge or other. But he was a man utterly insignificant, with nothing but a trunk and a German lock. He had been lying more than 20 years behind his screen, saying nothing, knowing nothing of the world nor of trouble, saving his halfpence. And now, at a frivolous idle word, the man had actually gone off his head, was utterly panic-stricken at the thought that he might have a hard time of it. And it never occurred to him that everyone has a hard time of it. If he would only take that into consideration, Okeanov said afterwards, that we all have a hard time, then the man would have kept his head, would have given up his antics, and would have put up with things one way or another. All day long nothing was talked of but Semyon Ivanovitch. They went up to him, inquired after him, tried to comfort him, but by evening he was beyond that. The poor fellow began to be delirious, feverish. He sank into unconsciousness so that they almost thought of sending for a doctor. The lodgers all agreed together and undertook to watch over Semyon Ivanovitch and soothe him by turns through the night. and if anything happened, to wake all the rest immediately. With the object of keeping awake, they sat down to cards, setting beside the invalid his friend, the drunken cadger, who had spent the whole day in the flat and asked leave to stay the night. As the game was played on credit and was not at all interesting, they soon got bored. They gave up the game, then got into an argument about something, then began to be loud and noisy, finally dispersed to their various corners, went on for a long time angrily shouting and wrangling, and as all of them felt suddenly ill-humored, they no longer cared to sit up, so went to sleep. Soon it was as still in the flat as in an empty cellar, and it was the more like one because it was horribly cold. The last to fall asleep was Okeanov, and it was between sleeping and waking, as he said afterwards. I fancied just before morning 2 men kept talking close by me. Okeanov said that he recognized Zimoveykin, and that Zimoveykin began waking his old friend Remnev just beside him, that they talked for a long time in a whisper. Then Zimoveykin went away and could be heard trying to unlock the door into the kitchen. The key, the landlady declared afterwards, was lying under her pillow and was lost that night. Finally, Okeanov testified he had fancied he had heard them go behind the screen to the invalid and light a candle there. And I know nothing more, he said. I fell asleep and woke up, as everybody else did, when everyone in the flat jumped out of bed at the sound behind the screen of a shriek that would have roused the dead, and it seemed to many of them that a candle went out at that moment. A great hubbub arose. Everyone's heart stood still. They rushed pell-mell at the shriek, but at that moment there was a scuffle with shouting, swearing, and fighting. They struck a light and saw that Zimoveykin and Remnev were fighting together, that they were swearing and abusing one another, and as they turned the light on them, one of them shouted, "It's not me! It's this ruffian!" And the other, who was Zimoveykin, was shouting, "Don't touch me, I've done nothing. I'll take my oath any minute." Both of them looked hardly like human beings, but for the first minute they had no attention to spare for them. The invalid was not where he had been behind the screen. They immediately parted the combatants and dragged them away, and saw that Mr. Prohartchin was lying under the bed. He must, while completely unconscious, have dragged the quilt and pillow after him, so that there was nothing left on the bedstead but the bare mattress, old and greasy. He never had sheets. They pulled Semyon Ivanovitch out, stretched him on the mattress, but soon realized that there was no need to make trouble over him, that he was completely done for. His arms were stiff, and he seemed all to pieces. They stood over him. He still faintly shuddered and trembled all over, made an effort to do something with his arms, could not utter a word, but blinked his eyes, as they say heads do when still warm and bleeding, after being just chopped off by the executioner. At last the body grew more and more still. The last faint convulsions died away. Mr. Prohartchin had set off with his good deeds and his sins. Whether Semyon Ivanovitch had been frightened by something, whether he had had a dream, as Remnev maintained afterwards, or there had been some other mischief, nobody knew. All that can be said is that if the head clerk had made his appearance at that moment in the flat, and had announced that Semyon Ivanovitch was dismissed for sedition, insubordination, and drunkenness, if some old draggle-tailed beggar woman had come in at the door calling herself Semyon Ivanovitch's sister-in-law, or if Semyon Ivanovitch had just received 200 rubles as a reward, or if the house had caught fire and Semyon Ivanovitch's head had been really burning, he would in all probability not have deigned to stir a finger in any of these eventualities. While the first stupefaction was passing over, while all present were regaining their powers of speech, were working themselves up into a fever of excitement, shouting and flying to conjectures and suppositions, while Ustinya Fyodorovna was pulling the box from under the bed, was rummaging in a fluster under the mattress, and even in Semyon Ivanovitch's boots, while they cross-questioned Remnev and Zimoveykin, Okeanov, who had hitherto been the quietest, humblest, and least original of the lodgers, suddenly plucked up all his presence of mind and displayed all his latent talents by taking up his hat and, under cover of general uproar, slipping out of the flat. And just when the horrors of disorder and anarchy had reached their height in the agitated flat, till then so tranquil, the door opened, and suddenly there descended upon them like snow upon their heads a personage of gentlemanly appearance, with a severe and displeased-looking face. Behind him, Yaroslav Ilyitch. Behind Yaroslav Ilyitch, his subordinates and the functionaries whose duty it is to be present on such occasions, and behind them all, much embarrassed, Mr. Okeanov. The severe-looking personage of gentlemanly appearance went straight up to Semyon Ivanovitch, examined him, made a wry face, shrugged his shoulders, and announced what everybody knew, that is, that the dead man was dead, only adding that the same thing had happened a day or two ago to a gentleman of consequence, highly respected, who had died suddenly in his sleep. Then the personage of gentlemanly but displeased-looking appearance walked away, saying that they had troubled him for nothing, and took himself off. His place was at once filled, while Remnev and Zimoveykin were handed over to the custody of the proper functionaries, by Yaroslav Ilyitch, who questioned someone, adroitly took possession of the box, which the landlady was already trying to open, put the boots back in their proper place, observing that they were all in holes and no use, asked for the pillow to be put back, called upon Okeanov, asked for the key of the box which was found in the pocket of the drunken cadger, and solemnly, in the presence of the proper officials, unlocked Semyon Ivanovitch's property. Everything was displayed. 2 rags, a pair of socks, half a handkerchief, an old hat, several buttons, some old soles, and the uppers of a pair of boots. That is, all sorts of odds and ends, scraps, rubbish, trash, which had a stale smell. The only thing of any value was the German lock. They called up Okeanov and cross-questioned him sternly, but Okeanov was ready to take his oath. They asked for the pillow. They examined it. It was extremely dirty, but in other respects was like all other pillows. They attacked the mattress. They were about to lift it up, but stopped for a moment's consideration, when suddenly and quite unexpectedly something heavy fell with a clink on the floor. They bent down and saw on the floor a screw of paper, and in the screw some dozen roubles. "Ahey," said Yaroslav Ilyitch, pointing to the slit in the mattress from which hair and stuffing were sticking out. They examined the slit and found that it had only just been made with a knife, and was half a yard in length. They thrust hands into the gap and pulled out a kitchen knife, probably hurriedly thrust in there after slitting the mattress. Before Yaroslav Ilyitch had time to pull the knife out of the slit and to say "ahey" again, another screw of money fell out, and after it, one at a time, 2 half-roubles, a quarter-rouble, and then some small change, and an old-fashioned solid 5-kopeck piece. All this was seized upon. At this point it was realized that it would not be amiss to cut up the whole mattress with scissors. They asked for scissors. Meanwhile the guttering candle lighted up a scene that would have been extremely curious to a spectator. About a dozen lodgers were grouped round the bed in the most picturesque costumes, all unbrushed, unshaven, unwashed, sleepy-looking, just as they had gone to bed. Some were quite pale, while others had drops of sweat upon their brows. Some were shuddering, while others looked feverish. The landlady, utterly stupefied, was standing quietly with her hands folded, waiting for Yaroslav Ilyitch's good pleasure. From the stove above, the heads of Avdotya the servant and the landlady's favorite cat looked down with frightened curiosity. The torn and broken screen lay cast on the floor, the open box displayed its uninviting contents, the quilt and pillow lay tossed at random, covered with fluff from the mattress, and on the three-legged wooden table gleamed the steadily growing heap of silver and other coins. Only Semyon Ivanovitch preserved his composure, lying calmly on the bed, seeming to have no foreboding of his ruin. When the scissors had been brought and Yaroslav Ilyitch's assistant, wishing to be of service, shook the mattress rather impatiently to ease it from under the back of its owner, Semyon Ivanovitch, with his habitual civility, made room a little, rolling on his side with his back to the searchers. Then, at a second shake, he turned on his face, finally gave way still further, and as the last slat in the bedstead was missing, he suddenly and quite unexpectedly plunged head downward, leaving in view only two bony, thin, blue legs, which stuck upwards like two branches of a charred tree. As this was the second time that morning that Mr. Prohartchin had poked his head under his bed, it at once aroused suspicion, and some of the lodgers, headed by Zinovy Prokofyevitch, crept under it, with the intention of seeing whether there was something hidden there too. But they knocked their heads together for nothing, and as Yaroslav Ilyitch shouted to them, bidding them release Semyon Ivanovitch at once from his unpleasant position, two of the more sensible seized each a leg, dragged the unsuspected capitalist into the light of day, and laid him across the bed. Meanwhile the hare and flock were flying about, the heap of silver grew, and my goodness, what a lot there was! Noble silver roubles, stout, solid rouble-and-a-half pieces, pretty half-rouble coins, plebeian quarter roubles, 20-kopeck pieces, even the unpromising old crone's small fry of 10 and 5-kopeck silver pieces, all done up in separate bits of paper in the most methodical and systematic way. There were curiosities, too. 2 counters of some sort, 1 Napoleon d'or, 1 very rare coin of some unknown kind. Some of the roubles were of the greatest antiquity. They were rubbed and hacked coins of Elizabeth, German kreutzers, coins of Peter, of Catherine. There were, for instance, old 15-kopeck pieces, now very rare, pierced for wearing as earrings, all much worn, yet with the requisite number of dots. There was even copper, but all of that was green and tarnished. They found 1 red note, but no more. At last, when the dissection was quite over, and the mattress case had been shaken more than once without a clink, they piled all the money on the table and set to work to count it. At the first glance, one might well have been deceived, and have estimated it at 1,000,000. It was such an immense heap. But it was not 1,000,000. Though it did turn out to be a very considerable sum of exactly 2,497 roubles and a half, so that as Zinovy Prokofyevitch's subscription had been raised the day before, there would perhaps have been just 2,500 roubles. They took the money, they put a seal on the dead man's box, they listened to the landlady's complaints, and informed her when and where she ought to lodge information in regard to the dead man's little debt to her. A receipt was taken from the proper person. At that point, hints were dropped in regard to the sister-in-law, but being persuaded that in a certain sense the sister-in-law was a myth, that is, a product of the defective imagination, with which they had more than once reproached Semyon Ivanovitch, they abandoned the idea as useless, mischievous, and disadvantageous to the good name of Mr. Prohartchin, and so the matter ended. When the first shock was over, when the lodgers had recovered themselves and realized the sort of person their late companion had been, they all subsided, relapsed into silence, and began looking distrustfully at one another. Some seemed to take Semyon Ivanovitch's behavior very much to heart, and even to feel affronted by it. What a fortune! So the man had saved up like this. Not losing his composure, Mark Ivanovitch proceeded to explain why Semyon Ivanovitch had been so suddenly panic-stricken, but they did not listen to him. Zinovy Prokofyevitch was very thoughtful. Okeanov had had a little to drink. The others seemed rather crestfallen, while a little man, called Kantarev, with a nose like a sparrow's beak, left the flat that evening, after very carefully packing up and cording all his boxes and bags, and coldly explaining to the curious that times were hard, and that the terms here were beyond his means. The landlady wailed without ceasing, lamenting for Semyon Ivanovitch, and cursing him for having taken advantage of her lone, forlorn state. Mark Ivanovitch was asked why the dead man had not taken his money to the bank. "He was too simple, my good soul. He hadn't enough imagination," answered Mark Ivanovitch. "Yes, and you have been too simple too, my good woman," Okeanov put in. "For 20 years the man kept himself close here in your flat, and he's been knocked down by a feather while you went on cooking cabbage soup and had no time to notice it. Aha, my good woman." "Oh, the poor dear," the landlady went on. "What need of a bank? If he brought me his pile and said to me, 'Take it, Ustinyushka, poor dear, here is all I have. Keep and board me in my helplessness so long as I am on earth,' then, by the holy icon, I would have fed him, I would have given him drink, I would have looked after him. Ah, the sinner! Ah, the deceiver! He deceived me, he cheated me, a poor lone woman." They went up to bed again. Semyon Ivanovitch was lying properly now, dressed in his best, though, indeed, it was his only suit, hiding his rigid chin behind a cravat, which was tied rather awkwardly, washed, brushed, but not quite shaven, because there was no razor in the flat. The only one, which had belonged to Zinovy Prokofyevitch, had lost its edge a year ago, and had been very profitably sold at Tolkuchi market. The others used to go to the barber's. They had not yet had time to clear up the disorder. The broken screen lay as before, and exposing Semyon Ivanovitch's seclusion seemed like an emblem of the fact that death tears away the veil from all our secrets, our shifty dodges and intrigues. The stuffing from the mattress lay about in heaps. The whole room, suddenly so still, might well have been compared by a poet to the ruined nest of a swallow, broken down and torn to pieces by the storm. The nestlings and their mother killed, and their warm little bed of fluff, feather, and flock scattered about them. Semyon Ivanovitch, however, looked more like a conceited, thievish old cock-sparrow. He kept quite quiet now, seemed to be lying low, as though he were not guilty, as though he had had nothing to do with the shameless, conscienceless, and unseemly duping and deception of all these good people. He did not heed now the sobs and the wailing of his bereaved and wounded landlady. On the contrary, like a wary, callous capitalist, anxious not to waste a minute in the idleness, even in the coffin, he seemed to be wrapped up in some speculative calculation. There was a look of deep reflection in his face, while his lips were drawn together with a significant air, of which Semyon Ivanovitch during his lifetime had not been suspected of being capable. He seemed, as it were, to have grown shrewder. His right eye was, as it were, slyly screwed up. Semyon Ivanovitch seemed wanting to say something, to make some very important communication and explanation, and without loss of time, because things were complicated, and there was not a minute to lose. and it seemed as though they could hear him.
"What is it? Give order, do you hear, you stupid woman? Don't whine. Go to bed and sleep it off, my good woman. Do you hear? I am dead. There's no need of a fuss now. What's the use of it, really? It's nice to lie here, though I don't mean that. Do you hear? You are a fine lady. You are a regular fine lady. Understand that. Here I am dead now, but look here. What if that is... perhaps it can't be so. But I say, what if I'm not dead? What if I get up? Do you hear? What would happen then?